Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are grappling with a story that I think fundamentally rewires how we understand the last 50 years of history.
It really does. We're going to be looking at the systems that determine who lives, who dies, and, how the global economy actually functions.
And to get started, I think it helps to go to a very specific place, a street corner.
Right. So I want you to picture this. We're in Santiago, Chile. The year is, say, late 1972, maybe early 1973.
The atmosphere there is just electric, it's polarized, it's dangerous.
Absolutely. And if you walk through the wealthy neighborhoods, these upper-class enclaves like Las Condes up in the hills, you start seeing something strange appearing on the white garden walls.
It's graffiti.
Yeah.
But it's not the usual political slogans you'd expect. It's something else. It's a warning.
Exactly. It's spray-painted in these jagged letters. Jakarta Vin. Or sometimes it's just a single word.
Jakarta.
Jakarta.
And if you were just an average person in Chile walking past those walls, unless you were plugged into a very specific, very high-level frequency of global intelligence, you would be completely baffled.
Of course. I mean, Jakarta is the capital of Indonesia.
Right. It's 10,000 miles away, an archipelago in Southeast Asia. So why are wealthy, conservative Chileans spray painting the name of a Southeast Asian city on their garden walls in South America?
That is the question. And it's a question that really launches our investigation today because, as we're going to find out, Jakarta in this context wasn't a place.
No.
Wasn't a travel destination.
Not at all. Jakarta was a code word. It was a meme, really, before we had the internet. It was a metaphor for a specific, brutal solution to a political problem.
So when those people wrote Jakarta is coming, they weren't talking about a city.
No, they were signaling a specific system of extermination.
And today, that's what we're doing. A deep dive into the Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins. But we need to be clear. We aren't just here to recount a timeline of the Cold War.
Right. This isn't a standard history lesson about East versus West or, spies versus spies.
Our mission here is to analyze this whole thing through the lens of institutional design.
Yes. The central argument Bevins makes, and the one we really have to grapple with, is that we typically look at mass violence or coups or genocides as these, explosions of madness.
We see them as glitches in the system or just moral failures of bad men. We think, oh, if only that dictator hadn't been so crazy.
Exactly. But Bevins is arguing something much, much more disturbing. He's saying that the mass violence of the Cold War, and specifically the extermination of unarmed civilians, was a structural product.
It was a feature, not a bug.
Precisely. The thesis here is that the U.S.-led international security system created an incentive architecture. And that architecture, it rewarded the creation of capitalist authoritarian regimes.
And the physical annihilation of their opponents.
That's the method. So when we see Jakarta on that wall in Chile, we're seeing the end result of a process, a method that had been perfected years earlier and thousands of miles away.
And to understand that graffiti, we have to understand the machine that built it. We have to look at what we're calling the crisis in perception, how we fail to see these events as a structured global governance strategy.
So let's unpack this system.
Yeah, let's. Because I think for a lot of us, when we think of the Cold War, we think of spy novels, we think of Jean Le Carré, the Berlin Wall.
Maybe nuclear standoffs where nobody actually pushes the button.
Right. It's almost nostalgic in a weird way.
It is for the West. It absolutely is. But Bevins points out that for the people in the third world, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Cold War wasn't cold at all.
No.
It was a bloodbath. It was a hot war, and it was fought in their living rooms, their rice paddies, and their union halls.
And to understand why, we have to look at what we'll call the architecture of the system. And this doesn't start in the jungles of Indonesia. It starts in the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of Washington, D.C.
Right.
We have to talk about the domestic incentive structure within the United States government after 1945.
This is so critical. You can't understand the violence that happens abroad without understanding the pressure cooker at home. We need to talk about McCarthyism.
Okay.
But I want to be careful here, because that term often gets reduced to just Senator Joe McCarthy, yelling at people on a black and white TV.
Right, guy waving a piece of paper shouting, "I have here a list of known communists."
Correct. But we need to strip away the personality of Joe McCarthy and look at the mechanism. Bevins makes the case that McCarthyism was actually a top-down process. It was driven by the presidency and the FBI, and it fundamentally rewired how the entire U.S. government processed information.
So it wasn't just some rogue senator's witch hunt.
No, it was a purge of nuance. I
Yeah.
mean, think about the incentives.
Uh-huh.
Imagine you're a mid-level bureaucrat in the State Department in the late 1940s.
Okay.
You have the Truman Doctrine, which frames the entire world as a binary conflict. Free peoples versus enslaved peoples, good versus evil. And then you have J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI.
Hoover is the architect of the logic we're about to discuss. He's kind of the systems administrator of this whole paranoia.
He is. Hoover created what Bevins describes as a logical death trap. Some call it the Hoover death trap. It's a completely closed loop.
How did it work?
Hoover's logic went like this. If you are accused of being a communist, or even just communist adjacent, you cannot defend yourself if you deny it.
That's exactly what a communist would do.
Exactly. They would lie to conceal their true motives. So denial is proof of your guilt.
Wow.
And if you tried to use data, if you pointed out that the Communist Party USA had very few members and like zero actual political power, Hoover would argue that its invisibility was further proof of the danger.
Because it meant they were underground, a fifth column just waiting to strike.
Right. It's a Kafkaesque nightmare. There's no way out. If you admit it, you're guilty. If you deny it, you're a liar, so you're guilty.
Uh-huh.
If you say, look at the facts, you're just trying to distract us, so you're guilty.
And this creates a survival mechanism, right? For politicians, diplomats, intelligence officers.
Of course.
Yeah.
If you wanted to keep your job or get elected, you had to be hawkish. You had to be the most anti-communist person in the room, being soft on communism.
Was political suicide.
Total career suicide.
Yeah.
So this explains so much about why foreign policy became so aggressive. If I'm a diplomat and I'm looking at a complex situation in, say, Indonesia,
Right.
and I suggest that maybe we should negotiate with the leftists because they represent poor farmers and they aren't actually controlled by Moscow. I'm not just making a policy suggestion.
No, you are putting a target on your back in Washington. You risk being hauled in front of committee, losing your job, your reputation.
So nuance was purged from the system. The system selected for people who saw the world in black and white. And this had a devastating effect when the U.S. turned its gaze to the rest of the world, specifically the emerging third world.
We need to clarify that term, third world, because today in 2024, it's often used as, a pejorative or just a synonym for poor countries.
It is.
But that wasn't the original meaning at all, was it?
Not at all. The third world was a political project. It was an aspirational term. It described this movement of newly independent nations, Indonesia, India, Egypt, Ghana.
Nations who were saying, look, we just got rid of the British, the Dutch, the French. We don't want to be run by London or Paris anymore.
But, they said, we also don't want to be satellites of Moscow or Washington.
They wanted to be the third option, the non-aligned option.
Yes. This was all crystallized at the Bandung Conference in 1955. It was a massive moment in history that we often just skip over in Western schools.
It's true.
You had leaders like Sukarno of Indonesia standing up and saying, essentially, we want independence. We want neutrality. We want to trade with everyone. We want to build our own future.
And this is where we run into the system error, because the U.S. domestic system, which was wired for that binary us versus them view we just discussed,
You literally could not process the concept of neutrality.
it didn't compute.
Right. To the U.S. security establishment, if you weren't explicitly with us, you were potentially against us. And because many of these third world movements were anti-colonial, meaning they were fighting against European powers who were U.S. allies, they were often viewed with deep, deep suspicion.
It's interesting. Bevins brings up something he calls the Jakarta axiom. Originally, in the 1940s, Jakarta meant supporting independence. But that meaning shifted.
It shifted dramatically. As the Cold War hardened, control over resources and markets became totally linked to national security.
Of course.
The U.S. realized that these new nations were full of stuff, rubber, oil, minerals, that the global economy needed. Neutrality was seen as a risk. What if they nationalized those resources? What if they started trading with the Soviets?
So the incentive structure shifts from support freedom to enforce alignment.
Correct. And this brings us to the question of how. How did the U.S. enforce that alignment? Because, and this is a key point in institutional design, they didn't just start with mass murder. The system had to learn.
It had to iterate.
It had to iterate. And we see a really clear example of this learning process in Indonesia itself. Before the really famous events in 1965, there was a major failure in 1958.
Right.
In 1958, the CIA tried what we might call the Frank Wisner approach. Wisner was a huge fan of covert ops and direct intervention, all that, boys on adventure stuff.
So what did they do?
The CIA actually armed rebels in the outer islands of Indonesia to try and break up the country or overthrow President Sukarno.
This is the operation where that American pilot Alan Pope got shot down, right?
That's the one. He was flying a B-26 bomber, bombing civilians and churches on a Sunday morning. He gets shot down, and he has all his ID papers on him. It was a total humiliation for the U.S.
It exposed the entire intervention.
Completely. And the result was that Sukarno, the president of Indonesia, he actually got stronger. He rallied the people against this foreign aggression.
So direct intervention failed. It backfired.
Spectacularly. So the system pivoted. This is the crucial moment of institutional learning. Under the Kennedy administration, we see the rise of what's called modernization theory.
Modernization theory. That sounds very academic, very harmless, like urban planning or something.
It was designed to sound that way.
Yeah.
It was driven by intellectuals like Walt Rostow. And the idea was that the U.S. shouldn't just fight wars. It should build nations.
But specifically, it should build nations that look like the U.S.
Right. And the most efficient way to do that, they decided, was through the military.
This is the turning point. Instead of fighting the Indonesian military, the U.S. decided to buy it.
They wooed it. They courted it. They invited thousands of Indonesian officers to Kansas, to Fort Leavenworth, for training. But here's the key. They didn't just train them in how to shoot guns.
What else?
They trained them in governance. They trained them in economics. They trained them to view their own population as a potential enemy.
And they set up these things called Civic Action Programs, or CAP.
Yes, this is the institutional groundwork being laid. The U.S. funded and trained the Indonesian army to go into the villages and build roads, build schools, distribute rice. The goal was to create state within a state, negara dalam negara.
So you have the official government, led by President Sukarno, which is leftist, anti-imperialist, and neutral.
And then underneath it, funded by the U.S., you have this parallel structure, the military, that is building its own infrastructure, its own loyalty networks, and its own ideology.
You were building the machine.
Exactly. They were building the machine. And they just kept that machine humming, waiting for the right moment to turn it on. Which brings us to the prototype, the moment where the Jakarta Method is actually born.
Let's go there. Section 2, the prototype, Indonesia, 1965.
To understand 1965, you really have to look at the players. You've got President Sukarno, the founding father, very popular. You have the army, backed by the U.S., and then you have the PKI.
The Indonesian Communist Party.
Right. And we need to be very, very clear about what the PKI was at this time. Because the American image of a communist party is often, guys in the mountains with AK-47s smoking cigars.
Right, guerrillas.
That was not the PKI. The PKI was the largest communist party in the world, outside of China and the USSR. They had 3 million card-carrying members.
3 million.
And if you count their affiliated organizations, farmers groups, women's groups, youth groups, they had maybe 20 million followers.
And they were legal.
Completely legal.
Mm-hmm.
They were unarmed. They had chosen what they called a parliamentary road to socialism.
They were winning elections.
They were winning elections. They were organizing labor unions and literacy campaigns. They weren't hiding in the jungle. They were in the village hall.
Which, in a way, made them much more dangerous to the U.S. system than a guerrilla army.
Oh, much more. Because they were popular. They were winning the argument on the ground. You couldn't just bomb them because they were the people.
So if you wanted to remove the PKI, you couldn't just fight a battle.
No. You had to remove a slice of society.
So the trigger event happens, September 30th, 1965.
It's a very confusing night. A group of junior army officers kidnaps and kills 6 top generals. They claim they are protecting President Sukarno from a right-wing coup that was planned by a council of generals.
Even today, the details of who exactly ordered what they're murky. But what matters for our analysis is the framing.
Immediately, this is the crisis in perception, in action. Despite all the evidence that this was an internal military struggle, maybe a mutiny, maybe a provocation, the narrative is instantly set by General Suharto, who conveniently wasn't killed, and the U.S. propaganda machine.
And the narrative is?
The communists did this. It's a massive coup attempt. They're coming to kill us all.
And this is where we see the transition from political conflict to extermination. How do you go from 6 dead generals to 1 million dead civilians in just a matter of months?
Bevins breaks this down into 3 institutional tools. The mechanism of extermination wasn't just people got angry. It was designed. The first tool was propaganda.
And this propaganda was specifically designed to dehumanize.
It was incredibly visceral. The military took control of all media, all of it. And they spread this story about Gurwani, the women's movement affiliated with the PKI.
This is one of the most disturbing parts of the book. Gurwani was a feminist organization, right? I mean, they were setting up kindergartens, fighting for literacy, advocating against polygamy.
Yes, they were a progressive, modernizing force. But the military propaganda claimed that on the night of the general's murder, Gurwani women were there, dancing naked.
That's the story they told.
They claimed the women castrated the generals, gouged out their eyes, and engaged in demonic sexual rituals.
Which was a total lie.
A complete fabrication. Autopsies later showed the generals were shot. There was no mutilation. But the lie worked. It was designed to trigger religious and moral panic in a conservative Muslim society.
It painted the communists not just as political rivals,
But as moral monsters,
Hmm.
as witches, as subhuman. And if you believe your neighbor's a witch who castrates men, you don't debate them.
You kill them.
You kill them. So that's tool 1, narrative and dehumanization. Tool 2 is coordination.
This is where that state within a state we talked about comes online.
It does. The U.S. Embassy and the CIA were in constant contact with the Indonesian army. They provided radios. Now, this seems small, but in an archipelago nation of thousands of islands, secure high-frequency communication is everything.
It's the nervous system.
The U.S. provided the nervous system that allowed the Army to coordinate the sweeps across the entire country.
And they provided small arms.
Yes, weapons covertly shipped in to help clean up.
But the third tool is, for me, maybe the most chilling. It's the one that transforms mass murder into an administrative task. Tool 3 is the data.
The lists.
Right. Bevins details how Robert Martins, who was a political officer at the U.S. Embassy, had been compiling data on the PKI for a long time.
He had index cards, names of thousands of communists, labor organizers, student leaders, and it wasn't just the embassy.
Who else?
Managers of U.S.-owned plantations, rubber plantations, oil companies, they had their own lists of troublesome union
They could have
leaders.
just handed them over.
They handed them to the Indonesian army, and the army used them as checklists. They would go to a village, call out the names, take the people away, and kill them.
And later, the U.S. officials would check to see who had been captured or killed.
Effectively crossing them off.
It's breathtakingly bureaucratic. We're talking about teachers, farmers, union reps, people whose crime was organizing a strike or teaching peasants to read.
And this is where the crisis in perception is most acute for the victims themselves. They didn't understand what was happening. They thought they were living in a political system where they were legitimate actors. And then suddenly, the system redefines them as pests to be exterminated.
We have to ground this in a human story. The book follows a woman named Francisca.
Francisca's story is such a powerful anchor in this book. She wasn't a high-ranking official. She was a translator. She worked at a library. She was a mother.
She was married to a leftist journalist.
Right. And because of that association, her entire life is dismantled.
She's detained.
Detained. Not for a crime, but for who she is. And the description of her experience in the camps is just harrowing. Torture, sexual violence, the complete and total stripping of humanity. She describes being in a cell, hearing the screams, not knowing where her children are.
And the psychological break she described, she talks about how she believed she was building a nation. She was part of that post-colonial generation that really thought, we are free, we are building something new.
And then the state turns on her with absolute ferocity. That's the trauma. It's not just the violence, it's the betrayal of the national project. The Jakarta Method didn't just kill people.
It killed an idea.
It killed the idea of that third way. It killed the idea that you could have a politics based on redistribution and independence without being completely destroyed.
And the scale of it. We're talking 500,000 to 1 million people killed. Rivers clogged with bodies.
So many bodies in the rivers in East Java that they started causing flooding. And there was total impunity. The perpetrators remained in power for decades. And the West didn't look away.
No, the West cheered.
The West cheered. Which brings us to Section 3, system replication. Because if this was just a horror story about Indonesia, it would be tragic enough. But the point of the book is that this became a model.
A template.
A template. Success replicates, that's the rule of systems. The destruction of the PKI and the rise of General Suharto was viewed in Washington and London as a massive victory.
Someone called it the best news in Asia since the war.
Exactly. I mean, think about the ROI, the return on investment. No U.S. soldiers died. The country was immediately opened up to foreign investment. The IMF came in. Companies like Goodyear and Freeport gained access to all these resources. The incentives worked. The system rewarded the atrocity.
So naturally, the system decided to export the product.
It did. And this brings us to Brazil. Bevins uses the story of a woman named Ing Jiak Tan to make this connection physically manifest.
Ing Tan, she's an Indonesian girl.
Yes. In 1962, her family sees the tension rising in Indonesia. They decide to flee the Cold War violence. They get on a boat and they move to Brazil, thinking it's a paradise, that it's far away from all the conflict.
And the tragedy is they arrive in Brazil just in time for the 1964 coup.
They flee the Jakarta dynamic in Jakarta, only to find the exact same dynamic waiting for them in São Paulo. In 1964, the Brazilian military, with U.S. backing, overthrows the democratic government.
And this is where the parallel track starts. The Brazilian military had studied U.S. doctrine. They were the star pupils.
They were. And after their coup, they became the exporters of this technology of repression to the rest of South America. Brazil acted as a sub-imperial power.
So they trained the Chileans?
They helped train the Chileans, the Uruguayans, the Argentines. They passed on the methods.
Which brings us right back to that graffiti in Santiago. Jakarta is coming.
By the early 1970s, the Jakarta metaphor had gone global. In Chile, you had Salvador Allende, a democratically elected socialist. He was trying to do exactly what the PKI had tried in Indonesia.
Socialism through the ballot box.
Right. And the right-wing forces in Chile and their backers in the CIA looked at Indonesia and said, we know how to solve this.
You had a playbook.
There was actual talk of a Plan Jakarta inside the Chilean Navy. Officers were plotting to kill 10,000, maybe 20,000 people to cleanse the nation. They used the word Jakarta to signify a specific threshold of violence.
So it wasn't just a coup, it was restructuring of society through mass murder.
That's what the word meant. And this all evolved into Operation Condor.
Operation Condor was the system upgrade, wasn't it?
It was. It was a cross-border network of intelligence sharing and assassination between the dictatorships of South America, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia.
It's like a franchise model for state terror.
It was an internet of repression before the internet. If a Chilean dissident fled to Argentina, the Argentine secret police would pick him up and hand him over or just kill him. Yeah. They shared data, they shared methods, they shared the U.S.-supplied communications infrastructure that made it all possible.
And Bevins points out that this is very similar to the stay-behind networks in Europe, right?
Yes. The U.S. had set up similar networks in Europe to fight a potential Soviet invasion. In Latin America, they turned those networks inward, against their own populations.
So we have a global infrastructure, we have a proven method, and we have a result: the elimination of the organized left across much of the Third World.
Which leads us to the big question of persistence. Why does this system last? And why do we fail to see it for what it is?
This is section 4, persistence and the crisis in perception.
Let's start with the economics. The regimes that the Jakarta Method built, Suharto's New Order in Indonesia, Pinochet's Chile, the Brazilian dictatorship, they were all integrated into the U.S.-led global market.
They were open for business.
Wide open. Western companies gained access to massive resources, copper in Chile, gold and oil in Indonesia. The global economy as we know it, the supply chains that bring us cheap electronics and clothes, was built on the stability provided by these regimes.
So reversing the violence, or even just fully acknowledging it, becomes too costly for the system.
Exactly. To question the legitimacy of Suharto or Pinochet was to question the legitimacy of the economic order they facilitated. This is the structural anchor. The violence wasn't an accident. It was the foundation.
And this creates the crisis in perception. We look back at history and we say, oh, the U.S. made some mistakes. There were some excesses, a few bad apples.
But Bevins's whole argument is that these were features, not bugs. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. It won the Cold War, it secured resources, it eliminated the alternative.
And the victims, the Third World movement and its dreams.
Physically eliminated. This is a crucial point. We often wonder, why is there no viable alternative to global capitalism today? Why is the left so weak in so many places?
Yeah.
Well, in many of these countries, the people who would have built that alternative were murdered. Their unions were crushed, their parties were banned. It's not that their ideas failed in a marketplace of ideas. The people holding the ideas were shot.
And that legacy isn't dead. It's not even past. It echoes. Bevins ends the book with a truly chilling connection to the present day.
He does. Brazil, 2016, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff.
Dilma Rousseff, who was herself tortured by the dictatorship back in the 70s.
Right. And during the vote to impeach her, a congressman stands up. His name is Jair Bolsonaro. and he dedicates his vote to Carlos Alberto Brazante Ustra.
Ustra was a notorious torturer. He was the man who ran the very unit where Dilma was tortured.
It was a monstrous moment. I mean, imagine a politician in Germany dedicating a vote to a concentration camp guard. But Bolsonaro did it. And he used the rhetoric of the Cold War.
What did he say?
He said, the world will celebrate what we do today because we are stopping Brazil from becoming North Korea.
He's summoning the phantom, the ghost of communism.
Exactly. The communists are long gone. There's no Soviet Union. But the structure, the rhetorical and institutional structure of anti-communism is still there, ready to be weaponized.
And we see it in Indonesia, too. Bevins describes a mob in 2017 surrounding a legal aid building.
Yes, because they thought a meeting about the 1965 massacres was happening inside. They were chanting, crush the communists and burn them alive.
In 2017.
In 2017, the institutional memory of the method is so strong that it overrides reality. It obscures the true origins of the violence and justifies new repression.
It's fascinating and terrifying. The Jakarta narrative is still being used to police the boundaries of what is politically possible.
That's the definition of a successful institutional design. It sustains itself.
So let's wrap this up. We've covered the architecture, the prototype, the replication, and the persistence. What are the key takeaways from the Jakarta method?
Well, first, I think we have to stop viewing these events as isolated tragedies. They were part of a loose but interconnected network of extermination programs.
Right. The Jakarta method was a structural solution to a geopolitical problem, not just a series of disconnected atrocities.
Second, the crisis in perception is our failure to see how this history shapes modern inequality. The world we live in, the cheap goods, the global supply chains, the political alignments, it all sits atop this pile of corpses.
The stability we enjoy was purchased with this method.
And finally, there's the question of the future. Bevins leaves us with a provocative thought. If this system was designed to produce these results, security through extermination, and the underlying system of global capitalism and security incentives hasn't fundamentally changed.
Are we safe from Jakarta returning?
If the incentives are still there and the memory of what happened is buried, the capacity for the method remains.
That is a heavy thought to end on. But that's why we do this. We have to see the system to understand the world.
Absolutely. Knowledge is the only way to break the perception crisis.
Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the Jakarta method. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
And for a shorter visual overview of this topic, check out the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Until next time.